the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to OnScript. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. I want to say a quick thanks to Jason Stark and Taylor Turzek who produce this podcast. Without their help, we'd be sunk. So we're so grateful for both of them. Also, if you're able to share the word about what we're doing here, I've given ideas for that in previous episodes, but you can also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey friends, welcome back to OnScript. This is Matthew Bates, professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary, where I co-lead master's and doctoral programs in New Testament. With me today to co-host is Jason Staples, who's more regularly on one of our other OnScript podcasts, the Biblical World side of things, but we love to drag him over here whenever we can. So Jason, why do you love the law of the Lord?
Because it is good and right and spiritual. Well, we can go further on this, but I want to get to our real critic here. The critic of the law that we're going to be interviewing. So let's talk there.
Yes, our guest today is Paul Sloan, author of Jesus and the Law of Moses, published by Baker Academic, 2025. This book's getting all kinds of positive buzz in the world of New Testament scholarship and beyond. Welcome, Paul. So, Paul, why do you hate the law of the Lord so much?
Oh, well, I do get frustrated with its condemning aspect, but you gotta live with the purpose God gave it for. So, no, I do love the law, and that was a big thing that I felt sort of provoked to write the book about, is just the notion that sometimes the law gets a lot of hate unduly, and so I thought let's pay attention a bit more.
Yeah, so this is definitely a law-friendly book, Jesus and the Law of Moses. So, but you open, Paul, by criticizing a TGC article that was penned by Joe Carter titled, "Survey, a majority of Christians don't believe the gospel." So in this Gospel Coalition article, Carter discusses the rich young man of Matthew 19, who asked Jesus about good works and eternal life. And Carter, writing for TGC, says this. I'm going to quote Carter for a minute. So begin, quote, "Jesus responded that if the man wanted to be judged by works, then he must keep the entire law and do so perfectly. The young man thought he had done enough good works to earn a place in heaven because he was judging himself by man-made standards rather than the perfect standard of God. But that's not how it works," end quote, from Carter. So why do you think this TGC quote shows some serious confusion, and how does it set up your book's central concerns?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a good question. So basically, it does a few things that, in my view, are erroneous. One is it begins by impugning the man's motives. He says that he wanted to be judged by his works, and that's a pejorative thing to say about this man. And that he thought I think if I'm remembering correctly, he says something along the lines of he thought he had done enough good works or had done the law perfectly enough or something like that to, secure a place in heaven. But that's assuming that we know the man's motives. And I think that's, as if that's the reason he asked this question. And I think the Gospels give you a different motive, which is that, no, Jesus has become widely known as this person who does have, this divinely revealed, has the authoritative answer as to what it means to be obedient to God, what it means to be a lawkeeper, and what it means to participate in the restoration. And he knows this about Jesus, and so he approaches him and asks him. So I think he asks it from a position of respect for Jesus. And then I don't think it's the man's sort of pejorative motivation to be judged by his works that leads Jesus to answer the way that he does, because of course the way that Jesus answers is keep the commandments. In Matthew 19. And I don't think that Jesus is trying to sort of show him, here's this impossible standard that then will pull the rug out from under and you need something else instead, like instead you need grace or faith or something like that. Jesus himself is the one who teaches, particularly in Matthew, that he's going to come and judge people according to their praxis, their deeds. And so it seems to me that it's actually Jesus' own motivation or conviction that judgment is going to be, taken into account a person's deeds, that he, and for that reason tells this guy to keep keep the commandments. Also, the notion of like sinless perfection or keeping the law perfectly to be considered a law keeper is itself, I think, is misguided. There are different ways to be misguided about that. And often people employ or kind of use James as a proof text to prove that, when I don't think that's quite James's point. James is addressing someone who thinks that, okay, well, if I want to, as long as I keep this one commandment, I'm really a law keeper. And James is saying like, no, that's not how it works. Like, you can't just like break this one over here and then keep this one over here and think that you're really a law keeper. But that's a different question than does the law itself require sort of a perfect law keeping to be considered, obedient? And there, just the answer is no. This covenantal relationship between God and his people assumes the commission of transgressions and assumes that assumes that people will need forgiveness for it. And this is even wrapped up, I mean, in the previous chapter, in Matthew 18, where Jesus is talking with his disciples. He's teaching them about how to be, how they ought to be forgiving of one another. So it's assuming that people are still going to commit transgressions. So I think there's this odd dichotomy between hearing the answer that you have to keep the commandments and then thinking, well, that must be an impossible standard and it requires all these things that, that are just impossible. And the irony to me, honestly, about this position, and it's there in the kinds of expositions that you just quoted from TDC, but lots of others, is that you basically have Jesus never really answering the guy. Because if keep the commandments is sort of like a wrong answer, or it's the correct answer, but you can't ever keep it, well, then Jesus needs to tell him the right answer eventually. Like, if he's giving him an impossible standard so that he'll reveal his need for something else, like, Jesus never clued him in on that. He never said, like, here's the something else you need, you need to check out Romans 3 when you get it or something, And so I think it's misguided for a few of those reasons. Just leaves that guy hanging dry.
So I want to jump in real quick, because I know that some of our listeners are going to hear that and they're going to say, but he does answer. He does take you to the end. In the end of that discussion, he does take you back to something else. And he says, okay, well, one thing you lack, sell everything that you have and give to the poor, and then come and follow me. And what he's really doing is he's saying, well, you tried the law, and obviously, that wasn't, you're going to learn that that's not enough. So now you need to come and follow me. How is that not the answer that Jesus is getting to? Because, I mean, that's the most common way to read this is, no, Jesus does he does answer it, and he answers it with, it's not about the law at all. It's about following me. So what would your answer to that be? And I know you spend a lot of time on this in the book itself.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And you're right. That's one other route that people go to. Well, the issue is that the person asks, it depends on which passage you're reading. Sometimes the person asks what one thing you lack, or sometimes Jesus is the one who says one thing you lack. But the point is, by stating it in terms of one thing you lack, well, it means that doing the next thing that Jesus says, selling and following Jesus, it complements the law keeping. It doesn't replace it. If you lack it, it means you're adding it to it, not that you're replacing it, right? And so this is, to me, one of the I don't know, it seems to be like one of the clearer aspects of the synoptic portrait of Jesus is that he's not saying people need to be allied to him over against Torah. He's saying people need to be allied to him and his exposition of it, his instruction of it, so that you'll thereby actually become obedient to God's divinely appointed servant, but also obedient to his instruction.
So one last quick follow-up on that, and that is, how do you see that? Do you think that actually ties in at all to the Deuteronomy expectation of a prophet like Moses? To him you must listen. Like, so, okay, you've done these things, but then there's one more thing that you have to do, which, I mean, I think might tie into some of your discussions, and we'll get into this more about eschatological jubilee and all that. But, and then there's also the question of the two tablets of the Torah of, your obligations towards God and your obligations towards humanity. And, I've seen a number of treatments about this that, kind of get into those things. I'm curious to know kind of where your thought is on why is that the one thing he lacks. If Jesus is really actually about keeping the Torah, is he actually even grounding his follow me in the Torah itself, or is this something actually external to the Torah?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'll take the last part first. When you said, "Is he grounding this in Torah?" I think it's a both and here. Where in the Gospels, at the Transfiguration, he's been appointed as the Son to whom they ought to listen, and that listen to him, I think, is probably alluding to that Deuteronomy 18 notion of there will be a prophet like Moses, and you ought to listen to him. And interestingly, so that there you actually get sort of two sides of the same coin. By listening to the divinely appointed prophet or son, well, you're actually thereby obeying a commandment because the commandment itself says to listen to him. And so by listening to him, you are, and doing what he says, you are also thereby fulfilling, a Torah obligation or a Torah commandment. So yeah, I think that's often the way it will work in lots of Jesus's exposition. There another good example is from Matthew 12. I know we might talk about this later, so I won't go into all the details on this particular passage, but Jesus defends his disciples from a certain action and then says, but if you had known this, you wouldn't have condemned the innocent. And his argument there, we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, but his argument there hinges upon his assertion that he is divinely authorized. And so that means that you have to recognize that he's been this divinely authorized or commissioned figure to recognize the legitimacy of his legal argument. And if they had, they wouldn't have condemned the innocent. And condemning the innocent is something that you ought not do. That's goes against Torah to condemn the innocent. And so if they had recognized Jesus' authority, then they wouldn't have broken this other commandment as well, namely condemning the innocent. So I think there's several examples in which that kind of thing, I think, plays out.
Well, one last follow-up on that first question, and that is, have you heard from anyone from TGC, any pushback on your book at all?
Not in an official capacity, no. I know some folks who write for them, and we've been corresponding, and so far they've actually been quite appreciative of it. I can tell where they'll disagree, but so far I'm expecting sort of a good, hoping and expecting a good sort of charitable correspondence between all that. I suspect that there'll be big differences in the Acts stuff, the Acts 15 stuff. Maybe among other things as well, but I know that one as well.
Well, that's good to hear. Let me go ahead and introduce our guest a little more thoroughly. Paul Sloan is chair of theology at Houston Christian University and associate professor in New Testament. He holds a PhD from St. Andrews, where he wrote a dissertation on the Gospel of Mark that was published under the title Mark 13 and the Return of the Shepherd, the Narrative Logic of Zechariah in Mark. That was in the Library of New Testament Studies series published by T&T Clark. Paul Sloan and Logan Williams also have a podcast. That podcast is called Jesus and the Jewish Law. So OnScript fans might want to check out that podcast, Jesus and the Jewish Law. Now, that's the academic stuff, Paul. What else do you want us to know about you?
Oh, gosh. Open book, man. No, I live in Houston. I've got 3 kids. They're a ton of fun. I got a 6-year-old, 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. It's a really, really fun time, fun age. We're also expecting, so my wife is expecting, and so we'll have a 4th coming in February. So house is getting fuller, but that's a ton of fun. And then, we'll take it from there.
Thank you. Congratulations, too, on number 4.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So the next thing here, I've got a question on this. One of the strongest sort of streams of your book, or strongest elements of your book, is your argument that so much of what Jesus is doing in the Gospels is really conditioned on his assumption of what you label, following E.P. Sanders, restoration eschatology. And specifically, this is the idea that Israel remains under sort of punitive punishment related to the covenant, and that Jesus in some way is coming to bring restoration or a fix to Israel's collective plight. Now, all this talk about Israel's need for redemption and restoration and all that sounds an awful lot like Tom Wright. Sounds like, so what I want to know here is what's the difference between what you're proposing and, are you just doing N.T. Wright reheated here, or is there something different about what you're proposing compared to what Wright has done?
That's good. Thank you. This is a really good question, because I was talking with someone who was already predisposed not to agree with Tom's positions on XYZ. And when I just began with, well, I think some of it's restoration eschatology, punitive discipline stuff, and this person just goes, oh, that sounds like Tom Wright. And just, I was like, oh, I lost him. Like this, I couldn't, I couldn't distinguish my position from his after that. It seemed to me. So there are considerable overlaps. I mean, I'm not at all shy about saying this. I've learned a great deal from Professor Wright, and appreciate so much of his emphasis on the component of restoration eschatology and the work that he did to put that on the map, at least on my personal map. I think he's absolutely right about that. The big differences between my position and Wright's, and many others have noted this, I'm not unique here, is I don't actually, I don't use the label exile in the way that he does. He often would use exile as some sort of metonymy or just sort of one word label for the punitive discipline. I think, and actually he didn't always do it. In fact, he was actually more careful than that. And it's more that often that a lot of people didn't read him as closely perhaps as they might have, but because he does actually carefully distinguish that, but he says it's a useful way to just refer to all of it. But I do distinguish myself there. I don't think the problem is a prolonged exile, at least not completely. Clearly, for example, like if the Judahites return back to the land under Persian rule, and they're back in the land, well, then their problem isn't quite exile. They're back in the land. But in fact, that's the important part. They're back in the land, and yet they still think the restoration hasn't obtained yet. And they use different language to describe their problem. Like in Ezra 9, you'll see that we're in great guilt, or we're still in captivity, or these people are raising the sword against us. So they use different labels to describe their continued plight. So that's one difference. It's not a major one, but it's slightly distinct. Also, I'm not a maximalist about it. I don't think every Second Temple Jewish text, out there just assumes this view. I do think a lot of them do. A lot of them do have this expectation that, okay, there's a continued plight, and we restoration is still on the horizon, and it looks different depending on the author of the text, that sort of thing, or the view of the text, or the view of their protagonist, or what needs to be done. But like lots of Jewish texts have this notion that, okay, restoration hasn't obtained, and now it's either starting with us now, or it's on the horizon and we just got to wait, or whatever. But that's one maybe slight difference. The other big difference is that, this probably refers, this is more related to the law. For me, when the restoration obtains, a feature of the restoration is the gift of the Spirit in all its different ways, the gift of the new heart, however it happens, whether it's Deuteronomy 30's heart circumcision, or heart purification in the Septuagint, or Jeremiah 31's image, or Ezekiel 36's image of a new heart. However it happens, those texts, characterize the new heart as enabling or equipping the person to actually become obedient to God's requirements, to God's the just requirements of the law. And so, for me, when Jesus is heralding the restoration, that doesn't come at the expense of Torah keeping, or not even at sort of this redefinition of it. That's sort of one of the big differences, because I think Professor Wright's view would still say, yeah, it is about Torah keeping, but it's been redefined, that sort of thing. And I think actually, I don't think it's quite been redefined in some of the ways that you've said. And so, in other words, I think the restoration is being heralded, but it's not at the expense of a somewhat conventional halakhic debates. Whereas would depict the restoration as obtaining, and thinking that, okay, well, now that the nations are being brought in or ushered in at this restoration, that's going to dissolve the distinction between Israel and the nations, and therefore, because so much of the law served to distinguish Israel from the nations, now that they're united and the nations are coming in, well, now those distinctive elements of Torah will fall away. And that helps explain why you see Jesus sort of sitting loosely to what we would call, now people call boundary markers, right? Like dietary laws, purity, Sabbath, temple stuff, right? Because for him, the law and the keeping of it inscribes this nationalistic self-identity. And because those customs inscribe one's nationalistic identity, then the very doing of them, right, inscribes that. But because now is the time in which the nations are coming in, and it's time for Israel to set aside that national distinctiveness, well, then therefore now it's time to set aside those distinctive customs. That's the way he does it. And I just think, no, Israel's distinctiveness can remain when the nations come in.
Thank you. And I have a question that I think will complement what you just spoke to a bit, because in chapter 1, you position your thesis about restoration eschatology and the law in the midst of some prominent, scholarly approaches to Jesus and the law from the past. And you kind of pull out 3 strands there. One, legalism, that's represented by Rudolf Bultmann. And then you have another option, compassionless exclusivism, that probably Marcus Borg is your leading representative there. And then nationalism, which you especially choose Wright, Dunn, and some others to illustrate that, but especially Wright. So can we maybe walk through those? We maybe will do maybe just briefly, like what are these 3 different approaches to the law that we've seen in scholarship in the past? How is your approach different? And when we get to Wright, you've already spoke to the nationalism a bit. We can just kind of just nod at that one. But yeah, could you walk us through those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so my point there in walking through previous paradigms is the reason it's relevant is because the paradigm or the framework that you think is operative as for your interpretation of the controversies and or the synoptic gospels themselves, that paradigm is going to end up conditioning all the different controversies. It's going to end up affecting your interpretation of all your different controversies. That's why it's important to me to walk through them, because if you think the problem is legalism, well, then of course, once you have any sort of conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, well, then of course we already know that the issue is the Pharisees are legalistic and Jesus isn't, right? So the interpretation of the controversies must be that, well, Jesus is more relaxed or is abrogating XYZ or whatever, right? And then same with compassionless exclusivism and nationalism. Like if you've already identified those things as sort of, the problem, well, then you're sort of like putting all the data through the same cookie cutter shape, and it's all going to come out the same. Like every single time Jesus's response is going to be against, it's going to be that Jesus is more compassionate over against the Pharisees who aren't, or something like that, right? So legalism has been a prominent one. It has a lot of the suppositions about sort of the badness, basically the insufficiency and the badness and the redundancy of external rituals, that they're just sort of they're done in order to merit favor from God and that sort of thing, and that doing rituals, sort of doing all these external rituals, really hindered the mind or heart's pursuit of the stuff that really mattered, like ethics, and so Jews and Judaism, in particular the Pharisees, had just gotten so legalistic by the time of Jesus that he needed to come and correct that. So that Jesus' preaching is sort of this great corrective against Jewish legalism. And so, which means then that so much of his discourse is about abrogating the external rituals and saying that, no, it's really about sort of, this gracious action of God, etc. Of course, I mean, in my view, the problem with those things is that Jesus, that the Pharisees also believed in grace. Jews and Judaism also, have the doctrines of grace and the notion of forgiveness through the covenant and through the legal system. So that it's not, Jesus sort of preaching about grace or forgiveness to them or God's love to them is not some sort of like newfound thought that they've never heard of, right? And also just like the notion that Jesus, disposed of the rituals is just it just ignores. It has to ignore lots of data, right? It just has to ignore lots of data, like Jesus healing the guy with lepra and then sending him to do the purification rituals, right? Or teaching his disciples how they ought to offer sacrifice after they've reconciled with their someone who has something against them in Matthew 5. Or even, just Matthew 5:17-20, which again, this is where I make that point. Bultmann, Matthew 5:17-20, of course, is where Jesus says, look, I didn't come to nullify a single thing, and Bultmann just says, well, of course, this can't be historical, and just like doesn't take into account, right? And then it's in one footnote. It's in one footnote in Tom Wright's Jesus and the Victory of God, and it just doesn't get, just doesn't get accounted for. And I thought, oh well, yeah, I can see why that passage would be difficult to account for if you think that Jesus actually is just making redundant whole swaths of the Torah. And so the other thing is there's a sort of cruel. I use this phrase in the book. I think there's like a cruel double standard in Bultmann's description of Judaism that Jesus encounters over against Jesus' own exposition of it. So any time that like Jews or Judaism would teach XYZ, Bultmann would be like, oh, that's bad when they do it. But when Jesus does it, he's doing it from a position of authenticity, So like, for example, I'm trying to think of some of the examples. Like Jews demand repentance because they think it's a merit securing good deed. Whereas when Jesus does it, when Jesus demands repentance, it's because he's really being authentic about that. It's really just this, this thing. I thought, gosh, like, I guess you would have to think that if you already have this presupposition that, well, Jews and Judaism just simply are legalistic, well, then everything that they do, you're going to just run through that framework, right? And so even when Jesus and his Jewish contemporaries, prescribe the same thing, it's legalistic when they do it, but it's good when Jesus does it. So that sort of thing was rough. The compassionless exclusivism one is, I kind of single out Marcus Borg there. There, the notion is that Marcus Borg had this, in my view, misunderstanding of ritual impurity, and he pitted it over against basically compassion, and the thought was that that Jews sort of followed a pattern of ritual purity and holiness, in a sense that made them separate from one another, and that this intense concern for purity was really othering, so that other people who were in states of ritual impurity were felt othered by people who cared about ritual impurity, and so that the Pharisees, for example, were just making a bunch of Israelites just feel really bad about themselves, that sort of idea. And so that when Jesus is coming along, Jesus is saying, no, it's more about compassion. And the way to pursue holiness is to become more compassionate, and so that it was this Jesus is preaching against ritual purity for the sake of compassion, and then Marcus Borg just sort of took that as a paradigm to describe Jesus' sort of oppositional stance to all sorts of nationalistic boundary markers like Sabbath, dietary laws, ritual purity, temple stuff, and then the nationalism one is what I already described. The law and the keeping of it inscribed this nationalistic identity. But now that the time of the restoration is here and it's time for that nationalistic distinctiveness to go away, well, therefore it's appropriate for these distinctive customs to also go away. There's also more to it than that for Professor Wright's view. He would also say that that the keeping of the Torah sort of fomented violence, like sort of violent. It fomented this nationalistic pursuit of liberation, and so because Jesus was against a nationalistic pursuit of liberation through violence, he stopped, or sat loosely to Torah commands because he was aware of the fact that those Torah commands were inscribing that sort of violent pursuit. So. I kind of describe those, and I think for the last one, I would just say that one of the errors there is that of course you can keep the Torah without being violent, right? like keeping Torah, it does not just automatically lead to sort of this nationalistic pursuit of violence. So I just thought there was the error there in Wright's view.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's helpful because I think you're right. We do tend to have these grids that are infrastructures that we have in place kind of on the front end of the biblical data, and we kind of filter everything through it. So if we're convinced that Jesus was just being anti-legalistic, well, then everything we read gets kind of filtered through that lens. So your own lens is restoration eschatology, and we're certainly going to get into that a little bit more. Let's change gears here, and then after this, we'll maybe hand it over to Jason for a question. But let's do a speed round just to change gears. So the goal here is just a really quick answer, and you don't really get to defend your answer. You just say it.
Okay.
So is artificial intelligence intelligent?
No.
Would you rather hike 50 miles or bike 500 miles?
Hike 50.
All right, so I'm always hunting for new fiction recommendations. I don't know if you're a fiction reader, but
Nick Cutter.
Okay. What's a book title for me?
So so I like horror. So if you don't like horror, don't read this. I like horror, and Nick Cutter's a fun horror author. So Little Heaven, try that, or The Deep, or The Troop.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
The author himself says that they are transgressive. So if you don't if that's not your thing, I get it.
It's a little ironic given the book that you've written.
Yeah. Those were his words. He said they're transgressive. Okay, sorry. Go on.
Also, if you were to become a professional athlete, what sport would it be in?
Basketball. No question.
I've got one to add to that. Then
Oh, like what would I want to be, or just like which one could I do if I had 10,000 more hours of expertise?
It was an ambiguous question.
Basketball is the answer no matter what. So whatever, doesn't matter.
Okay, so we're gonna add another speed round question here. You versus WNBA star basketball player Brittany Griner in 1-versus-1. Who wins?
I'm gonna say, with trepidation, me. But only because I'm gonna shoot the outside shot. If she posts me up, she'll beat me.
You know why I'm asking this question, so because you have a little more you could say about your basketball career on this. So
I can't remember if she was on the team or not. I was on the practice squad for the Lady Bears, the women's basketball team after they won the championship. I was on the practice squad for a few practices, which was a ton of fun. So yeah, it was a ton of fun. Yeah. I one time jumped for a rebound, and Kim Mulkey yelled at me. She goes, "Don't jump, Sloan." I was like, "Oh, sorry." I think it's because I did, trying to avoid injuries, obviously. So anyway.
Well, so you can hoop it quite a bit. I'm taking it then.
He's a good player.
So how about this one? What's your least favorite job you had before becoming a professor?
I worked for I can't remember the title. Sorry, it was like a breakdown crew. I can't remember what were just like a kind of like a maintenance type crew. If like whenever a camp had something to set up on Baylor campus, I just would go set up all the tables and chairs and set everything up and then tear it down. And then that was it. And it was like, 99 degrees in Waco, Texas in the summer. And it was not enjoyable. I liked being a waiter. I was a waiter. I liked that a lot.
You're building the ultimate hamburger. What do you put on it?
Bacon, poblano, chipotle mayo, grilled onions, and a hamburger bun.
No deep fried onions? Come on.
I said grilled onions, didn't I? I guess not deep fried. I don't want deep fried onions. Yeah, grilled onions. I could do. Oh, cheese. I didn't say cheese. My goodness, cheese.
How many patties?
If all that on there, I'm probably just doing one patty. If it was those like smash burgers, I would do 2 patties. But yeah.
So I got another speed round question for you. What's one book in New Testament studies that you'd advise every layperson read?
One book in New Testament studies that you advise every layperson to read. I love Isaac Oliver's Torah Praxis. I don't know if it's New Testament studies, we're saying it doesn't have to be accessible. I love Isaac Oliver's Torah Praxis after 70.
All right, so let's go ahead and get back to the rest of the thought out interview. So throughout the book, you return again and again to the idea of one law conditioning or overriding another law. Can you explain what this means and why this is so important for understanding Jesus' teachings in the Gospels?
And maybe do it with a specific text if you can, like to make it nice and concrete, if you can think of one.
Like Sabbath, for example.
Yeah.
One of the things that you spend a good amount of time on is the whole Sabbath controversy with Jesus' disciples plucking and eating the heads of grain in the field. And one of the things that you argue specifically, you say this is not Jesus approving the breaking of Sabbath just in general, saying, oh, Sabbath regulations don't matter anymore because, I've abrogated that aspect, but that Jesus is actually engaging in some really specific law interpretation here that operates according to certain principles that you then highlight, principles like conditioning and then override. And I'm curious, this is something that I think those who might be interested in reading this book, they'll want to know a little bit about how you're explaining this sort of thing. And I think this is one of the most important things. I mean, I as people will find out if they look this book up, I'm one of the endorsers of this book. I think this is an excellent book that people should read. But one of the most valuable contributions of this book, I think, is your very clear explanation of those aspects. And to say, because this is one of those things that it's so common for, you go into a basic church and you'll have someone, they'll go through these stories of Jesus healing on the Sabbath or the heads of grain. And the answer is Jesus shows that, it's not about keeping Sabbath anymore, that, Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Therefore, go out and do whatever you want, and Sabbath doesn't really matter. He's abrogated this, and the law is no longer operative in the same way. You take a very different angle to that, and I think it's really important to show the kind of legal reasoning that Jesus is engaging in here. So please take that and explain those concepts.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jason. Okay. So an override, the basic idea of it about an override is when two commandments, or multiple, but let's just say two commandments potentially come into competition, and one simply must be suspended in order to keep the other. In other words, one commandment overrides another. So the example that I go through a lot in the book, and a lot of people probably are aware of, is the notion of circumcision. Right? Circumcision must be done on the 8th day of the boy's life, but also you're not to work on the Sabbath. So what happens when the 8th day of the boy's life is on the Sabbath? What do? You will either have to violate the temporal component of the circumcision commandment in order to keep Sabbath, or you'll have to violate Sabbath to keep the circumcision commandment, and particularly its temporal component. Which do you do? For various reasons, which we'll go into right now. The most of our extant evidence suggests that they ruled that circumcision overrides Sabbath. In other words, you circumcise even if it means that you profane Sabbath by that act. And that actually becomes the language. You profane Sabbath to do it. The language of profaning Sabbath to do the other commandment is importantly, in fact, this is where I make a lot of hay out of John 7:23, because John 7:23 says, it's when Jesus is saying, look, you all you'll circumcise on the Sabbath. A man will receive circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken. ... In other words, one commandment is kept. One commandment is profaned or, quote, violated, right, quote unquote, to keep another commandment. But that law breaking or that suspension of that one commandment is overall functioning within a framework of law keeping. It's so that the law isn't broken, even though a particular commandment is temporarily suspended in order to keep another one. And so that's the important part about overrides. Overrides suspends the obligation to keep one other subordinated commandment out of the duty to keep the other one. And circumcision and Sabbath keeping are the obvious examples there. But you get other examples. And another easy one is priests working in the temple and sacrificing, right? So Israel is not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath, but also God tells the priests to make sacrifices every day. This means that the priests, if they're to keep their commission duty, they will have to profane the Sabbath to make the appropriate sacrifices. So when they're making their sacrifices on the Sabbath day, it is work, and it is, according to Jesus, profaning the Sabbath but it is permissible and thus innocent because they're doing their divinely authorized duty. And so the way I put it sometimes is to say, like, look, what if they kept the Sabbath at the expense of making the offerings? Then that would actually be transgression because they've transgressed their divinely appointed duty to make the offerings. I think that's the stuff of Jesus' legal reasoning in Matthew 12. So we can look at that briefly, or do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah, explain how Jesus is operating with that kind of legal reasoning and why one would override the other in that direction. Because you do in the book, you go through the kinds of hierarchies, for the lack of a better way to put it. There's a hierarchy to the different commands that is implicit, but Jesus definitely, based on your reading, operates by it. Please take us through that in terms of how he does this with Sabbath or anything else that you want to do.
Yeah, let's do Matthew 12 then. So Matthew 12 is when, right, we already mentioned it, the disciples they're on their way, everyone, Jesus and his disciples are on their way to a synagogue, and the disciples are hungry, and so they pluck grain to eat it. The Pharisees notice it, and they call it out, and they say, "Why are your disciples doing that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And then Jesus defends their action. Now, importantly, this is I think a big area where I think interpretations can go wrong. Importantly, Jesus concedes the accuracy of their accusation. He does not think they're wrong. He thinks, yeah, my disciples have done something that is not lawful. If all things were equal, and there were no other contextualizing factor, yeah, that would be Sabbath profanation that would render them guilty. That's unlawful action. The reason that's important to recognize is because he defends their action not by saying, oh no, here's a different reading of the Sabbath halakha. He defends their action by pointing to cases in which other people have violated certain commandments out of some superordinated duty. So his appeal to David, I won't go through like every detail of the argument, you can read in the book, but in my argument, I argue that his appeal to David is that, well, okay, David he appeals to the case in which David ate the showbread, and he says that David did what was he ate the bread that was not lawful for anyone to eat except for the priests. But his point is that David broke temple law. Now, I think David broke temple law, and that was permissible because in David's own argument, he says he was commissioned. David says, well, the king has commissioned me to a certain duty, da-da-da. Now, whether he's telling the truth or not, I'm not sure if that's relevant. It's that the priest hears that argument and recognizes, okay, if you've been commissioned by the king, well, then this is important, and yeah, I can suspend this. You're on an important mission right now, and I can suspend this requirement that this bread be only consumed by the priest and give it to you. And so he does. So there, David breaks temple law because of a combination of factors, one of which is his commissioned status to go do this important duty. But that would only be relevant in a case of Sabbath profanation if temple law overrides Sabbath law, or if temple law relates to Sabbath law somehow, right? Like if his disciples have been criticized for profaning the Sabbath, then it wouldn't make much sense to just end your argument with a point about temple law, unless people are assuming a hierarchy between, and a relationship between temple law and Sabbath law, which is what he then goes on to do. He goes on to say, okay, well, if David broke temple law out of, whatever reason that he did, well, haven't you also read that in the law that that the priests on the Sabbath in the temple profane the Sabbath and are innocent? That's Matthew 12:5. So there he refers to the fact that priests who are in the temple, that's an important point. He doesn't just say priests generally. He's saying that these are priests who are on duty. They're in the temple, which means they're doing temple duties, whether it's sacrifice or any other temple duty. But whatever they're doing because it's their divinely commissioned duty, and they profane the Sabbath in doing it. And he says, and yet they are innocent. So there's a really important point there, which is that I think this shows that Jesus' argument can't simply be here that human need overrides Sabbath, because that's often how this is taken. This is often taken to just indicate that, okay, well, Jesus is teaching them that human need overrides Sabbath. So when you're feeling hungry on the Sabbath, you should just be nice and meet those needs so that a person can eat, right? Like people already thought that about if someone's life were in danger, that you could suspend Sabbath to save life. Like that was already a conclusion that, seems to have been out there. But it doesn't appear to be the case that his argument is reductively that human need overrides Sabbath. Because if that were his argument, this appeal to the case of priests just would not make sense. It wouldn't contribute to the argument. Because the priests aren't meeting their own human needs. They're not sort of satisfying their hunger. They might be doing that incidentally if they're eating sacrificial food or something, but that's not why they're there. They're in the temple doing the sacrifices in order to keep their divinely commissioned duty of offering or doing whatever other temple duties. And so these priests are in the temple and they profane the Sabbath. But importantly, that's because they're, again, doing their commissioned duty. So I think that's the correspondence. David violated temple law, and in David's own argument, he's saying, I was commissioned by the king to do XYZ. And then he says, the priests do the same thing. They profane Sabbath law to keep their divinely commissioned duty. So at this point in the argument, he's just established that, okay, if they've accused me of Sabbath profanation, they've accused my disciples of Sabbath profanation, he then appeals to cases in which other people broke certain laws because of some superordinated duty. So David broke temple law, the priests broke Sabbath law. But here's the point. Those are only relevant if Jesus is himself about to make a commissioned argument. Like if he's about to say, and I'm commissioned to do this too, and so therefore, right, this legal logic applies. Also, it only applies if his commissioned work is at the same level as the temple, right? Because if you can profane Sabbath out of temple duties, well, okay. Like if they might follow his argument. They might be like, okay, yeah, for sure, we get it. Like the priests are commissioned to do their duty and they can profane Sabbath to do their temple duties, but you're not doing temple duties. And whatever work you're doing isn't as important as the temple, right? Which is why he just then follows up with the assertion that, no, it is. Like that's just his assertion in 12:6. Something greater than the temple is here. And I think he's referring to his duty or his heralding of the restoration. So there's more details I could go into there, but for the short of it, to kind of keep this 6.5 minute answer short, he's saying that like, okay, temple law overrides Sabbath law, and that people who are doing their commissioned work in the temple get to profane the Sabbath, but they're innocent. And here, I've been commissioned by God, and my duty is more important than the temple. Therefore, when I and my disciples are doing our commissioned work, we have the capacity to profane Sabbath, not because we think Sabbath is not relevant, but because it's subordinated to our commissioned duty.
So very quick follow-up on that. You mentioned, he says one greater than the temple here. So he doesn't even equate himself with the temple. He says that his duty is greater than the temple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That first of all is a really big claim. But one of the things that you do get into in the book is that there are, within the covenant, there are prescriptions, and you make a good point about this. You spend some time on this, that there are different prescriptions for specific breaches of obedience or whatever, where you can go and repent, and then you go to the temple, and those things are addressed within the context of the covenant. But then you make the point that there's a certain point of covenant breach when sacrifice and offering and temple stuff does not any longer atone. So is that what Jesus is getting at here? Is that why his work, you say his work is greater than the temple because of his restoration commission?
Yeah.
Is that what's really going on
Yeah.
here? So take us through that and take a minute or two here.
Yeah. So just the basic notion is that sacrifices are a benefit of the maintained covenant. They work to atone for the kinds of transgressions that they were given to atone for, right? So even when the covenant is completely maintained and everything's going great, there isn't a sacrifice for every kind of transgression, right? Like they're told, do not bring sacrifice, right? There is no sacrifice you can bring for the commission of murder. And so not all transgressions have an individual offering that goes with them. But also even beyond that, sacrifices are a benefit of the maintained covenant. And in Leviticus 26, one of the punitive disciplines is it's Leviticus 26:31. God says, "I will no longer smell your soothing aromas." In other words, he just says, I'm going to reject the sacrifices, right? And of course they're the benefit that they were given for. And just, I know sometimes I can sense people might cringe at hearing that sort of thing. I'm just so people are aware, this is not something I sort of came up with on my own, right? Like this is a pretty widespread view in Milgram and other folks' commentaries on Leviticus, just in case people want to resort to that. But anyway, the point is that, yeah, sacrifices cannot become the sort of thing that God does not accept once the covenant is violated in a certain way. And then my point is that sacrifices don't mend the breach, right? Sacrifices are a benefit of the maintained covenant, but once the covenant's violated such that the punitive discipline is being poured out, sacrifices don't overturn that. Sacrifices doesn't get Israel out of the punitive discipline. And that's how I take some of the so-called prophetic critiques passages. I don't like Isaiah 1, Jeremiah 11, those passages. I don't think those are just the prophets sort of just ragging on sacrifice because they don't like it, right? They're saying that, like, no, we've committed the kinds of transgressions that sacrifice cannot get us out of. And what God wants is for us to turn back to him and become obedient, and then sacrifice can be acceptable. But once this punitive discipline is coming, right, sacrifice can't avert this disaster. It's what Jeremiah says. So yeah, I think that's what's going on. In his heralding of the restoration, he recognizes that, look, the temple is good, God-given, it's great. But it in and of itself and its sacrifices cannot get us out of the mess. This is not simply a matter of, well, if the priest would just offer the right sacrifices, then the restoration would come. No, like, it's only going to come through the sending of messengers like John the Baptist and Jesus. And of course, it then becomes incumbent upon the people to listen to him, to turn back and listen to him. And so this is why his duty is greater than the temple. Not simply, it's not a sort of an enlightenment ideal that, well, Jesus' duty is better because it's ethical over against temple ritual. No, it's a matter of urgency. Jesus' duty is greater than the temple because it's a matter of urgency, and it's actually the thing that God has given to get people out of or through the punitive discipline. And sacrifice in the temple just wasn't given for that purpose. So that's why I think it's so, quote, greater than the temple.
Yeah, thank you. We probably need to start moving toward wrapping up. So I have a kind of wrap-up question. Jason may have one too. But the one I have, at least to kick us off in that direction, is one that's kind of practical advice for pastors and teachers who are trying to navigate these tricky issues with congregations. Congregations and pastors have often been steeped in frameworks of Jesus and the law that might be legalistic or might be more like Borg's, compassion, sort of exclusivism, or maybe rights nationalism. And you're trying to kind of implement a framework of restoration eschatology. How do you start? Like, how would you start if you were a pastor leading a congregation to a healthier view of Jesus and the law? Like, would you have them preach a sermon series? If so, how would you order it? That's the kind of that's kind of what I'm driving at here.
Yeah.
If you're trying to, like, pedagogically lead people, like, not instantly, but over, maybe months or a year to a healthier framework, what's your strategy?
A few things. Yeah, great question, Matt. A few things I think that would be helpful. One is teaching from Torah more, just in your sermons. That we don't have to always teach sort of a theology of Torah. Like, in other words, like our sermons, whenever the law comes up, either in the lectionary or in the preaching or in whatever, it doesn't always have to be just sort of the foil for Paul's gospel, right? That's often how it comes up, is that, like, okay, well, here's law stuff, and so we're going to preach it in such a way that maybe, accentuates a certain reading of Paul's, antithesis of it or whatever. And I think that's I don't think that's the correct reading of Paul, but that point aside, my point is simply that pedagogically, sometimes it's just worth it just to actually preach and teach from the law itself. It's got instructive, meaningful things that you can teach from without always turning it into a lesson about Torah, right? So I think teaching from it helps people see just its see how it's working on its own terms, and see what Paul and Jesus would describe as the goodness of the divine will. So that's one thing. But then, yeah, if you're doing, a series, I would recommend sort of getting people comfortable with the back end of Deuteronomy and getting people comfortable with the way the prophets are reading those texts, and then getting comfortable with the fact that the Gospels are depicting Jesus as sort of a prophet like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, announcing the positive version. Right now, it's not punitive discipline's coming. Now it's the positive stuff of restoration's coming, and so that you can. But if you've already coupled some of those sermons, whether the back end of Deuteronomy connecting to the prophets, then connecting to the Gospels, if you've already coupled those with some teaching from Torah itself, then I think people will not be shocked when all of a sudden you get to the Gospels and it's Jesus teaching Torah, and you think, okay, yeah, I've got a category for this. He's lots of different ways you could do it. I'd be happy to hear from others. I'm sure others have thought better about that. I mean, I will say I'm a teaching pastor at Heights Church in Houston, Texas, and the way I did it was through Sunday school. I just started showing them, but what we just talked through, back into Deuteronomy, back into Leviticus, taught them about ritual purity, taught them about temple stuff. And my big deal is they, what I want people to know is they loved it. Like, because they were learning something new, and they even themselves were saying, gosh, we've been in Sunday school our whole lives and feel like we're learning something for the first time. And they loved it. And that's not a brag on me. It's more that, like, I think any good teacher could have done this, is more just that I think sometimes we think people are a bit afraid of learning new stuff, and I think that's actually not the case.
So I'm going to cheat a little bit here and ask a compound thing. But first, a little bit less of a question than an observation. Repeatedly in this book, you point to prior interpretation by New Testament scholars who present Jesus as antithetical to Jewish tradition or interpretation, and they suggest that what Jesus is saying would be even shocking to, say, a typical Jewish sensibility, that sort of thing. And then you turn around and you highlight numerous examples in the Mishnah, Second Temple Jewish literature, even the Torah itself, that say basically the same thing that Jesus is saying. And, you say, look, Jesus is not saying anything shocking here. He's saying stuff that is well within the discourse that's already there. And it seems to me that one of the things that your book highlights is how little New Testament scholars tend to know about Judaism, or actually even the Old Testament, or especially the Torah, and then how important that background knowledge actually is if we're going to understand the New Testament itself. So to kind of make this into more of a question, and it's going to be a multi-pronged question, first of all, what was it that led you to this particular insight, and how and when did you decide to start taking that approach? And are there any specific resources that you would suggest that are accessible to the non-scholar listener who wants to gain some of this background knowledge and doesn't have somebody who's a teaching pastor who went to St. Andrews and got a PhD and learned this stuff? What about those people who want to know this stuff and get all that? And then, as an example of this, and this is where I'm cheating, I want to go into just a little bit of this, where you point out in the book that a lot of people think that when Jesus touched those that were described as having leprosy, or, lepra, which a lot of people think of as leprosy, and, you've spent a good amount of time demonstrating, along with a lot of other scholars, that this is not Hansen's disease. This is, skin diseases of various types, but it's a whole different thing. But that when he touched these people with lepra, that he violated the law, or that he's flouting purity regulations or something at all. But you show in the book that that's just wrong.
Right.
And so why is that? And what's really going on instead? And how could a pastor or lay leader learn this stuff? What would you suggest in those cases? And so maybe you can use that as kind of an example for how to go about this, and again, how you kind of came to recognize this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That's a really good question. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is my own sort of introductory foray into a lot of this was because I misspoke in David Moffat's office about impurity, and David Moffat was like, "What? That's not right. Here, read this book." And he just handed me Jonathan Klawan's Sin and Impurity in Ancient Judaism. That was back in 2013, whatever, 2012. I don't remember what it was. And I just, I was like, okay, great. And so I just read it on the side, and it was so interesting and helpful. And it just kind of put me on a different trajectory of then from there, Klawan's was sort of the gateway into, just reading Jacob Milgram, E.P. Sanders is not as Paul in the Palestinian Judaism, which I know everyone loves that book. I think Jewish Law from Jesus to Mishnah is his best book. Reading that, Isaac Oliver's stuff on Torah praxis, and just a lot of scholars who had themselves paid so much attention to the primary texts and had themselves spent their time in their books just walking people through it. I mean, it's not like I just mastered all this primary text material myself. Of course I didn't. I was first trained through people who themselves were masters and were walking through it really patiently. And so that was my gateway, was folks like those people I just mentioned. So once then I kind of got a better framework under my feet. It just helped then for me to go back and honestly just reread all the primary sources. So, I mean, before this book, I'd already read widely in Second Temple Judaism, but once I got this contract, I said, all right, I'm not going to do anything for the next 18 months except reread all the sources. And that's all I did. And so that, I mean, it is just what it takes. It just does. I mean, once you come with the supposition or conviction that, I mean, I'm talking to biblical scholars, and people who are listening to this are already biblical scholars. They don't need anyone to tell them that you got to read primary sources, right? But my point is that, like,
au contraire, I've heard a lot of people need to hear that.
My point is that, like, there was no like secret sauce. That was it. I just spent a lot of time doing that. And so, and then I'll say that, yeah, just stuff popped differently. You know, like you see. You mentioned the leper one, but I'll mention something else. First, that passage in Matthew 5 where it says if a brother has something against you and you're giving your offering, and then you recognize that someone has something against you, well, leave your offering there, go make a reconciliation, and then come back and make your offering, right? And I just, saw scholars say that, oh my gosh, this would have just absolutely astonished anybody. Sacrifice was the most important thing you could have ever done, and that would have just turned the world upside down. And I think, nope, that's Leviticus 5 and 6. Like if you've wronged somebody, you make it right first. You make it right first, and then you go make your guilt offering. And that's how Philo interpreted it. Philo's like, yeah, go make your guilt offering only after, though, you've made restitution with the guy you wronged, and Mishnah Yoma as well. So I was just like, it was just there in the Torah. I mean, so in other words, to me, I was like, when Jesus is saying that, he's not sort of contributing this unique ethical insight. He's just teaching Torah there. That is what Torah teaches. So that was a big part of it. The leper one is a really good example to go to, because it was the sort of thing, again, I learned about ritual impurity and lepra stuff through reading folks like Matt Thiessen and Isaac Oliver and Jacob Milgram and Paula Fredrickson. Just, they helped me think through a lot of this stuff. And when I came to that passage, it's a good example of, I give kind of a specialized reading of it, and a listener or reader could look and be like, okay, okay, great. Now I understand that those 4 verses a little bit better, but come on, who cares? And the part of the relevance is because what it's in my view, a misreading of those passages has been put to work in a paradigm that is just a incorrect and big paradigm. So, for example, when people will say that, okay, when Jesus touched the leper, he was violating the Torah out of compassion. And that this proves that, right, Torah was good for what it was, but Jesus is here now to introduce this new thing, compassion, and that's going to override XYZ. And what that ends up doing is inscribing this sort of contradistinction between Jews in Judaism who follow Torah and will thereby sort of not be that compassionate, over against Jesus, who's compassionate, so people who follow Jesus will be compassionate, right? Whereas it's based on a misunderstanding, like the Torah doesn't prohibit touching a lepros, a person with lepra. It doesn't prohibit contracting impurity. Jesus didn't violate the Torah by touching this guy.
Lepers were in the synagogues, right?
Yeah. Mishnah Negaim regulates their presence in the synagogues. They were not as often depicted, just these wildly ostracized. I mean, I'm not saying like, hey, being a leper wasn't that bad. Like, I'm sure it'd be terrible. You would rather not be one. My point is that, like, they were more integrated into society than people, I think, often recognize. And touching one was not a transgression. And so then I go through some detail there. I'll skip that for now. The bigger point, though, is that Jesus cleanses him. Jesus cleanses him And because the guy says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, yes, I am willing to be made clean. And then he touches him, and it says, and the leper was cleansed of him. And people have said, okay, look here, Jesus cleansed the guy, and cleansing is the work of priests. This is what priests do. Priests are the people who cleanse. So in cleansing the guy, he is issuing a challenge to the Jerusalem temple, sort of like a there's not room enough in this town for the both of us type idea. And in other words, he's doing what only the Jerusalem priests really ought to have done. And he's issuing them a challenge. And I thought, oh, interesting. What an odd thing to say. Like, what an interesting conclusion to have come to. Because like cleansing itself just has a polyvalent sense in Leviticus itself. Like Leviticus 15, the text about all this ritual purity stuff uses cleanse at least in two ways. In some cases, cleanse just means the thing that's defiling you has ceased. So if like a man with a prolonged discharge is impure while that discharge persists. But the text then says if he's cleansed from his discharge, well, all it means there is that his discharge has ceased. And now he's no longer has the condition that was rendering him pure, but he's still in a state of ritual impurity. So it says, now if the man is cleansed from his discharge, then he needs to go complete these steps to complete his ritual purification. And he says he's cleansed like 3 or 4 more times after that. So there's a polyvalent sense of cleanse. Sometimes it effectively just means heal, and then sometimes it means ritually purify. And I think this is borne out in both Leviticus 15 and in the Mishnah on the issue of lepra. And it's there in Mark 1. So when he cleanses the guy, it means he heals him, which then makes sense of the fact that he then sends him to complete the ritual purification process through the priests. So it's not that he's sort of like doing what the priests only could do and is issuing a challenge to them. It's literally that he's doing what the priests can't do, which is heal. And he then sends the guy to the priests so that they can do what Jesus cannot do, which is ritually purify the guy.
Well, I want to actually challenge you just for a second on that because
okay, good.
Because there's actually another way to think about this, and I think
okay.
we've talked about this before, and you actually have made this point that the priests don't actually cleanse per se as much as they pronounce the cleansing, or he's there to recognize or to acknowledge the cleansing and to go through the prescribed steps for reintegration in that sense. But what Jesus then is doing is greater than the temple. And then the temple validates and verifies what Jesus has done, right? That's the idea.
And I think that's what's going on with the witness thing. Send him as a witness to them, testimony to them. Because now this testimony is going to show them that, hey, this guy got healed from lepra. And that he points to later in Matthew 11 and other texts, he points to his healings as evidence that not only that restoration's coming, but particularly that he's the guy. Right. This is the whole, I make a lot of hay out of the John the Baptist exchange, right? Where he sends the disciples, are you the coming one or should we wait for someone else? And Jesus' response is, go and tell John what you see. The dead are raised, the lepers are cleansed, etc. But in other words, he points to his healings as evidence, yes, that restoration's coming because he quotes from prophetic texts about the restoration, but he also is answering the question, proving that he's the guy. Yeah, I am the coming one. So I think that's how the testimony serves, which also then helps explain, in my view, why Jesus kind of already expects the Jerusalem folks to recognize him, to be ready for him when he gets there, because he's sent witnesses ahead of himself, which helps explain his sort of this abrupt action there.
Yeah, you did some nice work connecting that ultimately to your interpretation of the temple action. It was interesting. Yeah, interesting move. And this book is just so rich in detail, really carefully researched. I think that it's something that I hope was obvious from the interview to our listeners, that this is a book that really does get down into the weeds of halakhic debate in terms of Second Temple Jewish sources and is thoroughly documented. This is not a lightweight contribution. So I hope that our listeners will choose to read it because there's so much that we didn't even get to in our conversation. I think Jason and I both had more notes, more questions, because it's a rich book, and I think everyone who reads it will deeply appreciate it, and that you've made a very substantial contribution through this book. So we're really grateful for you, Paul.
And I will say this before we go. I think that this book, if there has been a better book on Jesus done since E.P. Sanders' Jesus and Judaism than this book. I'm not aware of it.
That's y'all are being really kind, Matt. Thanks for all those comments on the book, and I appreciate that. Thanks very much for having me on, Jason. That can't be true. I appreciate that. I can't be the next captain. I love. Thanks for all those comments. I really do appreciate it. I do hope that people who aren't aware. I mean, yes, please read my book. I'd love that. That'd be great. If you're looking for just one of the best books outside of Sanders on Jesus and law stuff, and you don't want to read my book, read Isaac Oliver's Torah Praxis. That book's incredible.
Which is a great book.
Yep.
This is Matthew Bates and Jason Staples for OnScript. Our guest today has been Paul Sloan, author of the new book, Jesus and the Law of Moses. Jesus and the Law of Moses, published by Baker Academic 2025. You can find a link to the book and other info about this episode at www.onscript.study. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.